In Hitchcock's cinema, which is definitely more sexual than sensual, to make love and to die are one and the same. Wow, what a stunning, totally provocative thought from director Francois Truffaut. It immediately yanks back the curtain, right? It sets this perfect psychological tone for our exploration today. We're looking straight into the mind of a literal cinema god, peeling away that iconic silhouette to see the raw, beating heart underneath. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're zeroing in on the twilight of Alfred Hitchcock's legendary career. We'll track his unbelievable journey from a state of just absolute, untouchable industry power, straight through a really crippling professional and personal crisis, and finally, into a deeply revealing artistic renaissance. It's such a fascinating look at how aging, mortality, and some deeply hidden neuroses shaped the final works of the Master of Suspense. Part 1. Peak Powers and Lost Stars. Okay, let's dive into this. To really understand the depth of his eventual crisis, we first have to wrap our heads around the staggering heights he'd reached by the early 1960s. Over the previous decade, he hadn't just made a few good movies. The guy had directed 11 massive hits. We're talking Vertigo, North by Northwest, Psycho. He'd become his own producer. He was a major stockholder at Universal. He even owned the rights to several of his own negatives. I mean, Hitchcock seemingly had it all. He was practically a studio unto himself. But then, the foundation started to crack. Hitchcock's cinema was uniquely built on situations rather than deep character exploration. He relied heavily on the built-in charisma of massive A-list stars to make those wild situations feel grounded and real. But suddenly, James Stewart was looking just a bit too old for leading roles. Cary Grant voluntarily stepped away from acting entirely. And on top of that, he'd soon lose critical behind-the-scenes collaborators too, like his brilliant composer Bernard Herrmann and his trusted director of photography Robert Burks. This wasn't just a run of bad luck. It was a devastating blow that totally crippled his traditional way of working. And speaking of lost stars, get this, it's one of the most dramatic anecdotes of his whole career. Hitchcock was absolutely desperate to reunite with Grace Kelly. He'd even bought the rights to a novel specifically for her, a project called Marnie. The deal was practically done. The Prince of Monaco approved. She was genuinely tempted to do it. But then, geopolitics intervened of all things. French General de Gaulle launched a fierce tax threat against Monaco. So, to save face and keep a serious image for his principality, the prince had to compromise, and Grace Kelly was forced to definitively abandon the cinema. Just like that, Hitchcock's dream project was crushed by international tax disputes. Crazy, right? Part 2, the great flawed films. So the crucial point is that heartbreaking disappointment with Grace Kelly forced Hitchcock into a completely new era. Francois Truffaut coined a really brilliant term for the movies that followed. He called them the great flawed film. It's essentially an aborted masterpiece by a great director. But here's the absolute genius of this definition. These films aren't ruined by cheap commercial gimmicks. They're actually harmed by an excess of sincerity. And that completely changes our perspective. Instead of just writing off Hitchcock's mid-60s movies as financial failures, we can now look at them as deeply personal, almost uncomfortably straightforward confessions from the director himself. And Marnie is the ultimate example of this. With Grace Kelly out of the picture, Hitchcock cast Tippi Hedren, hoping to mold her into his next perfect blonde star. But Marnie was a commercial flop. And honestly, more than that, the production was a total disaster that permanently ended his working relationship with Hedren. The failure wasn't just financial, it was deeply, deeply personal, and it completely shattered his legendary self-confidence in a way he'd never, ever fully recover from. Part 3, a master in crisis. This leads us directly into the late 1960s. The once invincible master was now aging, he was shaken, and he was struggling against a radically changing Hollywood landscape. The consistent, super predictable hit machine of the 1950s had turned into this frantic, really uncertain struggle. He goes from the massive, epic scale of The Birds to the deeply flawed Marnie, and then just sort of stumbles through Torn Curtain and Topaz before finally reaching a renaissance with Frenzy. During this decade, he was completely adrift, trying to figure out where he fit into an industry that was suddenly obsessed with television and youth culture. And of course, the studios, smelling his vulnerability after Marnie, began to interfere. During the making of Torn Curtain and Topaz, the Universal executives pressured him terribly. The most flagrant injustice? They forced Hitchcock to drop his legendary composer Bernard Herrmann. And why? Because the studio wanted trendy pop records they could sell in discotheques. They completely disregarded Herrmann's masterful operatic style that had elevated Hitchcock's greatest hits in the first place. So Hitchcock was forced to cope with unworkable scripts and a system that just no longer respected his instincts. You can literally feel his deep frustration in this excerpt from a letter he wrote to Truffaut in 1970. He was complaining about industry taboos and budget constraints, and he wrote, quote, "We also have all kinds of other films which I refer to as accidental, filmed for the most part by amateurs." He felt trapped. He couldn't make the grand, sweeping films he wanted to, and he was watching cheap, amateurish, accidental blockbusters completely dominate the box office. The master was essentially locked out of his own kingdom. Part 4. Return to form. But you can't keep a genius down forever. In his 50th year of filmmaking, Hitchcock made this joyful, triumphant return to his roots in London with his 1972 hit, Frenzy. And this brilliantly illustrates something key. Historically, Hitchcock had two major types of films: the itinerary of a killer, like Psycho, and the innocent man on the run, like North by Northwest. In Frenzy, he masterfully combined his two greatest cinematic tropes into one stifling, nightmarish puzzle. We get to watch the real killer operate while simultaneously watching an innocent man get caught in this web of perfectly organized coincidences. It was vintage Hitchcock, totally updated for a modern era. But he also made a really crucial change. For Frenzy, Hitchcock finally abandoned his quest for glamorous Hollywood stars. Instead, he cast realistic, girl-next-door British actors. This casting choice totally renewed his cinematic realism. It injected this raw, almost documentary-like truth into a very, very gruesome story. Filming in Covent Garden, right in the lively London of his youth, the whole thing felt like a homemade slice of cake, baked by a 70-year-old master who had finally found his joy again. Yet mortality was always ticking in the background. 70. That's a very specific number. Around this time, Hitchcock actually underwent surgery to implant a pacemaker, and he absolutely loved showing it off to visitors. That pacemaker was mechanically engineered to regulate his heart at exactly 70 beats per minute. There is something just incredibly poetic about this, don't you think? The ultimate engineer of cinematic suspense, a man who plotted out every single frame of his films with sheer mechanical precision, now had his very own heartbeat engineered and regulated by a machine. And luckily, his mind was just as sharp and engineered as ever. For his final film, Family Plot, he designed this incredibly geometric puzzle structure he'd never even attempted before. Step 1. Introduce two completely parallel stories with totally different tones. Step 2. Slowly, methodically narrow the gap between them. Step 3. Make them mesh into a single cohesive story. It's like a giant puzzle. Even as his physical body was failing him, his intellect and his drive to invent new ways to thrill an audience remained completely untouched. Part 5. The Neurotic Genius. So, we've seen the rise, the fall, and the triumphant return. Now let's unpack the vulnerable man hiding behind that iconic, stoic silhouette. Truffaut provides an incredibly moving psychological profile of Hitchcock here. He describes him as an isolated, plump schoolboy who stood alone in the schoolyard. Because he felt physically isolated, he withdrew, viewing the whole world with immense severity. This was a man deeply afraid of losing his balance, literally and figuratively. He lived a strictly chaste life, a virgin until his marriage at 25, and remained entirely devoted to his wife Alma. Truffaut astutely points out that Hitchcock basically used the heavy, soundproof doors of the movie studio as a shield to protect himself from a world he found absolutely terrifying. And here is the most stunning revelation of this entire explainer. We always assume directors project themselves onto their heroes, right? But Hitchcock didn't identify with his handsome leading men. He didn't look in the mirror and see Cary Grant or James Stewart. He secretly identified with the cuckold, the monster, the man who is rejected by others, the guy who feels he has no right to love and can only look on from the outside. That was his ultimate trick. He made audiences around the world root for the handsome hero, while the creator himself was quietly, secretly aligning with the outsider lurking in the shadows. To really summarize his monumental legacy, we have to return to Truffaut's beautiful words. Hitchcock not only intensified life, he intensified cinema. He didn't just point a camera and record a documentary of reality. He pushed the boundaries of the art form, creating rules and visual languages that were way more demanding than writing a novel. He took his own fears, his neuroses, his intense need for control, and transformed them into a completely universal cinematic language. So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. Knowing what we know now, knowing that the Master of Suspense was actually a deeply fearful man who used the studio as a literal shield, and knowing he secretly identified with the monsters and the rejected rather than the golden heroes, how does this change the way you view your favorite Hitchcock film? I highly encourage you to go back and rewatch his classics through this incredibly human, deeply vulnerable lens. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive into The Explainer, and as always, keep learning.